The evening settled across the valley with a hush that felt almost sacred, a quiet so tender that even the breeze seemed afraid to disturb it. A single lantern glowed from a modest house tucked beneath the curve of the hills, its dim light spilling across weathered boards and resting on the tired face of a man who had grown used to silence. His days had long been measured by the sound of tools against wood, the cry of chickens in the yard, the creak of fences needing repair. He had once lived with laughter in these walls, once shared his mornings with another voice. But death had taken that warmth 3 years ago, and since then he had walked each path alone, his heart worn thin yet still beating, waiting for something unnamed. On this particular evening the air carried a weight he couldn't name. Shadows stretched long across the dirt road, and a faint echo of distant hooves reached his ears. He almost ignored it, just another traveller passing through, but something in the rhythm slowed his breath. He looked up, and that was when he saw her. She wasn't meant to be there, not in his world of broken routine. She stood beyond the fence line, as though the earth itself had placed her in his path. Her hair spilled dark and untamed across her shoulders, catching strands of fading light. Her clothes clung in tatters, marked by hardship, yet there was an undeniable strength in the way she held herself. Her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering. She appeared both fragile and unbreakable in the same breath. She was not asking for pity. She was simply standing, untamed, unclaimed, and impossibly alive. His steps faltered. For so long, his heart had lived in shadows, carrying grief like a cloak. But now something shifted. It was not a spark of sudden passion, nor the rush of reckless desire, but the quiet, overwhelming pull of recognition. He saw her, and in some unexplainable way it felt as though he had been waiting for her all along. The silence between them grew heavy, but it wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of possibility. The townsfolk nearby whispered in hushed tones, treating her as though she were less than human, but he couldn't look at her that way. She was not a prisoner to be traded, not a shadow to be dismissed. She was a woman standing in defiance of the cruelty that had sought to break her, and that defiance stirred something deep within him. He didn't ask her name. He didn't demand her story. He simply knew, with a certainty that came like a whisper from his own weary soul, that walking away would haunt him more than any burden of staying. So he stepped forward, not as a savior, not as a man seeking to fill the hollow ache inside himself, but as someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and still keep breathing. His voice was steady when he spoke, though his heart beat unevenly, betraying the storm inside. He offered her freedom, not with promises of love or protection, but with the simple act of giving her a choice. She didn't thank him, didn't smile, didn't soften, yet she followed when he turned away. And that quiet decision, so small in the moment, would alter the rhythm of both their lives forever. The road stretched before them in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't weigh heavy but begins to soothe. She walked barefoot over the rough boards of his wagon, her shoulders squared, her hand clutching a small stone as though it carried the last of her courage. He kept his eyes forward, guiding the horse home, but he could feel her presence behind him, steady and unyielding. It was as if the air had shifted simply because she was breathing in it, and for the first time in years he didn't feel like the only soul left alive in the world. Night fell, and they stopped beneath the timber line. He built a fire, offered her bread and water, watching as she ate slowly, deliberately, never once meeting his gaze. Yet he noticed the way her hands trembled slightly, how her shoulders eased when the warmth of the flames touched her skin. When she finally lay down with her back to the fire, her breathing calm but distant, he realized how fragile trust can be. She had followed him, yes, but she hadn't surrendered her fear, and so he didn't push. He sat awake long into the night, listening to the steady rhythm of her breaths, healing in their constancy, his heart learning to hope again in the presence of another's life. The dawn found them still together. She rose without words, her eyes carrying shadows of places he would never fully know. Yet she did not run. That small act of staying was more powerful than any vow. He led her toward his land, the hills opening wide as though the world itself was giving them space to begin anew. The house waited, silent, worn, patient, as if it, too, had been longing for footsteps other than his. She paused at the threshold, eyes darting to every corner, a wary animal, uncertain of her cage. But he gave her no chains, no orders, only the choice to sit, to eat, to rest. And slowly, hesitantly, she did. Something unspoken passed between them in those first days. She asked for salt at the table, her first word to him, and it felt like a prayer answered. He noticed her scars, the bruises hidden beneath fabric, the way she always gripped that stone as though it tethered her to herself. He didn't try to take it from her, didn't try to erase her pain. He only offered space, and in that space a fragile thread of trust began to weave. It was not yet love, but it was the beginning of healing, a balm for two broken spirits who had forgotten the sound of belonging. If you have ever known the weight of loneliness, if you have ever waited for a sign that your heart could still feel something true, you will understand what began in that silence. And if these words touch something inside you, let your heart respond. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, or subscribe so we may continue walking together through stories that remind us we are not alone. Every gesture, no matter how small, is a seed of connection, a healing flame that keeps this circle of stories alive. And so their journey began, not with a promise, not with fireworks, but with a fragile, unbreakable choice, to stay, to breathe, to heal together beneath the wide, endless sky. The earth turned beneath their feet, and the story of their love was only just beginning. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm so gentle it felt like the land itself was exhaling, relieved to witness the fragile bond that had begun to form between two souls who had once been defined by silence. At first, their movements inside the house were cautious, as if both feared that a sudden sound might shatter the delicate truce that held them together. He cooked simple meals, his hands steady, though his heart trembled each time he set a bowl before her. She ate without looking at him, yet she never refused, and that acceptance, quiet as it was, became the beginning of something new. He watched the way she carried herself, upright, deliberate, always aware of the exits, as though escape had been her only language for years. But when she sat near the fire, when the warmth touched her cheeks, there was a faint softening in her posture, like frost slowly loosening under the sun. He said little, not out of indifference, but out of reverence, understanding that words spoken too quickly could wound more than heal. Instead, he offered presence, a steady calm, a living reminder that she was no longer alone in her fight to survive. She, in turn, began to notice the small ways he lived. The care he took with the animals, the patience in mending a fence, the quiet sighs he released when the weight of memory pressed too heavily against his chest. There was grief in him still, a grief that hadn't vanished with her arrival, but instead of repelling her, it drew her closer. Pain recognized pain, and in that recognition was a strange kind of comfort. She understood what it meant to carry shadows, and she could feel his understanding mirror her own. At night, she kept to the bed he had offered, clutching her stone with one hand, the quilt with the other. He stayed in the chair, boots still on, his body weary but unwilling to rest until he was sure she was safe. Sometimes he heard her whisper in a language he didn't know, a broken fragment of dreams or prayers, and he let the sound wash over him like rain falling gently on dry soil. Those whispers became a rhythm in the silence, a melody of survival that soothed something deep within him. Their days grew into patterns, splitting wood, carrying water, repairing what time had broken. She worked beside him, her hands raw and strong, unafraid of the weight of tools or the sting of cold. He offered her gloves, she accepted without a word, and together they moved through tasks that needed no language. In the quiet labor of survival, a silent bond blossomed. It was not the fire of passion yet, not the rush of desperate love, but the steady warmth of trust beginning to take root. Sometimes he caught himself watching her too long, the curve of her shoulders as she bent over the basin, the strand of hair that always escaped its braid and brushed her cheek, the resilience in her stance as though the earth itself held her upright. He looked away quickly, ashamed of the longing that rose unbidden in him, but she noticed. Her eyes would flicker toward him, unreadable, and then drift away again. There was no accusation in her gaze, only the weight of someone who had known too many eyes that demanded, taken, consumed. His gaze was different, hesitant, unspoken, a gaze that asked without daring to claim. She began to leave traces of herself in the house. A shawl draped over the back of a chair, a small strip of cloth she had sewn, hanging in the window, the smell of herbs drying above the stove. None of it was loud, none of it was invasive, but slowly, the house that had once echoed with emptiness began to carry the quiet hum of shared life. For him, each small change was a healing touch, proof that she did not only endure within his walls, but began piece by piece to belong. One morning he found her kneeling in the garden, hands buried in the soil. The ground was still hard, frost clinging stubbornly, but she pressed her palms into it anyway, eyes closed as if the earth itself could give her strength. He stood in the doorway, watching, his breath caught in his chest. Something about that sight, the resilience, the quiet prayer of her body folded to the ground, moved him more than words ever could. She opened her eyes and caught him watching. For a moment, neither looked away. Then she returned to her task, and he turned back to his tools, yet the image stayed, etched deep into him. The nights carried their own fragile rhythm. Sometimes she trembled in her sleep, her lips parting with unspoken cries, her body curling tighter beneath the quilt. He never reached for her, never intruded, but he stayed awake, watching the fire burn low, whispering silent vows that she would not wake to emptiness again. And when the morning came, she would rise and face the day as if the night had not broken her, shoulders square, eyes steady. That quiet resilience was its own kind of beauty, one he honored with his silence. One evening, as the wind clawed at the windows and snow whispered against the glass, she sat closer to the fire than usual. He noticed her hands trembling slightly, though her face remained calm. Without speaking, he reached for another blanket and laid it near her. She looked at it, then at him, and for the first time her eyes softened. Not a smile, not yet, but something warmer, something almost like gratitude. She wrapped the blanket around herself, and though her voice did not rise, her silence carried a new note. Acceptance, faint and tentative, but real. In these small exchanges, their lives began to entwine. The silence was no longer a barrier, but a bridge, carrying unspoken words between them. He began to feel that the loneliness he had carried was no longer absolute, no longer crushing. Her presence, though cautious, was a balm, a healing weight that filled the house with quiet strength. And she, though still guarded, no longer looked at the door with constant fear. Slowly, her eyes began to rest on the fire, on the work before her, sometimes even on him. There was no grand declaration, no sudden revelation, only the steady unfolding of two hearts that had been shattered, and now, in the fragile rhythm of shared days, began to find the courage to breathe together. The bond between them was still wordless, but it was undeniable. And as winter pressed harder against the walls, they discovered that even silence, when shared, can be the most profound kind of love. The days turned, and with them, the unspoken thread that tied their lives grew stronger, preparing them for the next step neither had yet dared to imagine. The thaw of winter arrived slowly, as if the earth itself feared rushing such a fragile season of renewal. Snow melted in hesitant trickles down the eaves of the house, dripping into the softened soil that had waited for months beneath the frost. Inside, the air grew warmer, not only from the fire, but from the quiet companionship that had begun to take root. The man woke earlier now, his body trained to the rhythm of land and labor, yet each morning held a new weight of expectation, because he knew she was still there. And each morning she rose too, her steps soft across the wooden floor, her presence no longer foreign, but woven into the fabric of his days. The work that spring demanded was steady and relentless. Fences sagged under the weight of snow and needed repair. The chicken coop leaned, its boards warped and brittle, and the earth itself cried out to be turned, seeded, nurtured. He had always done these tasks alone, his silence unbroken, his strength spent on soil that yielded without gratitude. But now, when he carried the hammer and nails, she walked beside him. When he lifted beams, she steadied them. When he bent low to press seeds into the ground, her hands followed, brushing soil gently over each one, as though planting not only food, but fragments of her own hope. Their silence remained, but it was no longer heavy. It was alive, filled with the rhythm of shared work. He noticed the way she leaned into her tasks without complaint, how her body moved with quiet determination. Even when her palms bled from the shovel's handle, she did not stop. He offered her gloves again. This time she accepted with a glance that carried something unspoken, acknowledgement, trust, the beginning of gratitude that did not need words. One afternoon, while mending the western fence line, she stumbled. The ground was uneven, her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard against her side. He was beside her instantly, worry tight across his face. She pressed her lips together, shaking her head, unwilling to show weakness. But when she lifted her shawl, The bruises across her ribs revealed themselves in shades of purple and fading green, remnants of a violence that predated him. His jaw clenched, his hands curling as if ready to fight enemies who were no longer there. Yet instead of anger, he stepped back, giving her space, his voice low and gentle as he told her where she could find salve in the cupboard. She took it silently, applying it herself, the scent of pine and root oil filling the room. And though she spoke little, her eyes softened when she caught him watching. In that look lay something fragile, the comfort of being seen without being claimed, of being helped without being diminished. As days stretched into weeks, the patterns of their life deepened. She began to rise earlier, stepping into the morning chill with her bare feet wrapped in cloth, carrying buckets of water before he asked. He, in turn, began to cook more than he once did, setting aside portions for her before taking his own. The rhythm between them was wordless but precise, like two dancers who had learned to move in time without ever speaking the steps. It was in these small acts, the bread broken in silence, the tools passed from one hand to another, that healing flowed gently, like water finding its way through stone. At night, when storms pressed against the windows, she no longer curled entirely away. Instead, she lay with her back to the fire, but turned her face toward the room, her eyes lingering on him before they closed. He, who once sat through the nights haunted by memory, now listened for her breathing, the steady rise and fall that lulled his weary spirit into rest. On one such night, as lightning carved brief scars across the sky, she stirred from a dream, gasping softly. He did not touch her. He knew too well the dangers of reaching into another's pain uninvited. But he whispered into the dark that she was safe, that no harm would come here. Whether she understood the words or only the tone, she calmed, her breaths steadying once more. He remained awake, his own chest easing only when he was certain she had returned to peace. Spring blossomed further, painting the land with fragile green. Birds returned, their songs breaking the long silence of winter, and he noticed the way her eyes followed them, a hint of longing flickering there. She stood often at the edge of the field, watching the ridges in the distance as though listening for voices carried on the wind. Yet she did not run. Instead, she returned each time, her hands stained with soil, her shoulders squared. Slowly, she let herself exist in the world they were shaping together. One evening, while they split wood behind the barn, he handed her the axe. Her swing was awkward, too wide, but she adjusted quickly, learning from the rhythm of his strokes. Sweat lined her brow, strands of hair clinging to her cheek, yet she did not falter. He watched her in silence, admiration threading through the ache in his muscles. There was strength in her, not only of body, but of spirit, and he felt it heal something deep within him, something he had thought beyond repair. That night, when the fire burned low, she sat longer than usual beside the stove. She reached for a piece of cloth, mending her torn shawl, her fingers deft despite their scars. He shaved in the basin, his reflection catching glimpses of her quiet focus. The room smelled of smoke, wool, and the faint sweetness of the herbs she had begun to hang above the window. He realized then how different the house felt, less like a monument to grief, more like a place where life dared to grow again. Later, as the storm whispered outside, she moved her chair closer to the fire. He noticed the subtle trembling of her hands, the way her eyes darted once toward him and then away. Without a word, she reached for a log that had shifted in the flames, steadying it. His hand brushed hers, just briefly, and the world seemed to pause. Her skin was cool against his warmth, her touch deliberate but fleeting. For a heartbeat, they remained like that, hands nearly entwined before she pulled away. Yet in that moment, something changed. The silence between them was no longer a barrier, but a bridge, trembling yet unbroken. When she lay down that night, she did not turn her back to the room. She lay facing the fire, her breathing slow, her eyes closed, but her presence open. He sat in the chair, watching the glow settle across her face, and for the first time in years he felt the silence of the house as a comfort rather than a wound. By the time the fields were ready for planting, they no longer moved like strangers. They tilled the soil together, side by side, their hands pressing seeds into the earth as though writing promises into the future. She no longer clutched her stone so tightly, and sometimes, when she forgot herself, her lips curved faintly at the sight of new shoots rising stubbornly from the ground. He noticed, holding that rare image of her smile, like a treasure he would never speak aloud. It was in these days of work, of soil beneath their nails and sunlight on their backs, that the bond between them deepened beyond survival. It was still wordless, still unspoken, but it was steady, real, undeniable. They were healing not only themselves but each other, through labor, through silence, through the simple, stubborn act of staying. And as the season ripened, as the land turned green under their care, a new question began to breathe quietly between them. Not if they would remain together, but how much further this fragile, beautiful bond could grow. The days lengthened, stretching into evenings painted with amber skies, where the fields shimmered in the last light and the house stood like a sentinel against the loneliness of the plains. By then, the rhythm of their lives had shifted so naturally it felt as though it had always been so. She no longer hovered at the edges of the house, cautious as a bird ready to flee. Instead, she moved within it with quiet assurance. Her hands knew where each pot belonged, where the tools rested, how the fire liked to be fed. The stone she had once clutched day and night still remained with her, but sometimes she forgot it on the table until dusk. He noticed those small things, each one a sign of trust blooming softly, and each one he guarded silently, as though a fragile miracle had been placed in his care. They shared their work like two parts of the same body. When he repaired the coop, she steadied the boards. When she carried water, he met her at the door to take the weight. Their silences became threaded with meaning, pauses that were no longer empty but full of recognition. Sometimes her eyes lingered on him longer than before, a glance that spoke of questions unasked. Sometimes he caught himself watching her when the wind carried strands of her hair across her cheek, when the sun warmed her skin into a glow he dared not name. Each time his heart beat heavier, carrying both desire and restraint. One evening, as they cleared brush near the barn, she stumbled over a root, and before she fell, his hand caught her arm. For the first time, she didn't pull away immediately. She steadied herself, her hand resting over his, fingers deliberate, warm. The world seemed to still around them, the air holding its breath. Her eyes rose to his, steady, unflinching, and in that moment something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond neither had dared to claim aloud. It was only a touch, only a heartbeat, but when she let go, the imprint remained on his skin as though branded there. That night she carved small shapes into the wood of the porch, her knife etching simple lines, one like a mountain, the other like flame. He didn't ask what they meant. He only saw the way her shoulders eased as she traced them with her finger afterward, and he understood that for her, symbols were safer than words. For him, the meaning was clear. She was laying roots in this place, leaving pieces of herself as a way of saying she intended to stay. Yet, with the deepening of their bond came shadows from the past. The world outside their fragile peace had not forgotten her, and neither had the memories that haunted her dreams. Some nights she woke with gasps, her body tense, her breath sharp as though the walls around her had become a cage. He sat awake with her, not touching, not intruding, simply present. In the quiet, he whispered words like steady currents. "You are safe. No one will harm you here." His voice was healing not because of the words themselves, but because they came without demand, without expectation. Slowly, her breathing calmed, and she leaned against the quilt until the trembling eased. By dawn, when the light stretched pale fingers across the window, she no longer looked as if she might vanish into the wind. One stormy night, the wind battered the roof, rattling the shutters, and she startled awake, her eyes wide with terror. He asked softly if he could enter her room. When she nodded, he sat on the floor beside her bed, arms resting on his knees. She told him fragments of memory, her brothers taken, her hiding in the rocks, the sound of rifles echoing. Her voice broke, but she did not cry. Instead, she leaned close until her shoulder brushed his. Tentative, trembling, her hand slid into his. He did not move away. Their fingers intertwined slowly, deliberately, as though both feared the moment might dissolve if rushed. That night, they sat in silence, the storm raging outside, while within, something more powerful than fear was born. Afterward, she began to touch his hand more often, not by accident, but by choice. A brush while passing tools, a pause on the porch when the light dimmed, a quiet reaching across the table. Each time he felt it as a balm, easing the ache of years spent alone. And each time he gave her back the same steady stillness, offering her not ownership but presence. In those gestures intimacy blossomed, soft, patient, unspoken yet undeniable. The townsfolk noticed when he took her into town. Their eyes followed her, some with disdain, some with curiosity, some with hunger he despised. She walked beside him, shoulders straight, gaze steady, refusing to shrink beneath their stares. When a man spat words meant to wound, he stepped forward, his voice low but unyielding. "She is my woman." The words fell heavy, not as possession, but as protection, as acknowledgement of what already existed between them. She looked at him then, her eyes wide, and though she said nothing, he saw something shift in her expression, part disbelief, part fierce, quiet fire. Later that night, when they returned home, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, silent for a long time. Then, softly, she whispered, "You didn't need to say that." He looked at her, steady as always, and replied, "I wanted to." In that moment, her defenses cracked, not shattered, but softened. Her hand found his again, and this time she didn't let go. Seasons turned. The garden grew full beneath their care. The hens laid more steadily, and the once broken house now carried warmth, not from fire alone, but from the life they had built within it, She decorated small corners with herbs and cloth. He carved their names into the porch post beneath her symbols. Together they wrote a story in soil and wood, in silence and touch, in the healing rhythm of days shared. And then came the night when silence gave way at last. She leaned close by the fire, her eyes searching his, and asked the question that had lived in her heart for months. Why? Why had he chosen her? Why had he stayed? His voice was quiet, steady, yet trembling with the weight of truth. He told her she was not something he had done out of pity, not charity, not burden. He told her she was what he wanted. Her breath caught, her throat tightened, and tears threatened, though she tried to resist them. When his hand touched her cheek, she did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into it, warm against warm, her eyes closing. The kiss that followed was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was the inevitable flowering of all that had grown in silence, steady and healing. When their lips met, it was like a door opening in the heart, one that had long been locked. They held each other not as two broken souls clinging to survival, but as two people choosing, freely, deliberately, to stay. From that night forward, the silence was no longer filled with uncertainty, but with belonging. Their lives, once separate and fractured, had woven together into something whole. And though challenges lay beyond the horizon, though the world still carried dangers and memories, within the walls of that house, in the soil of that land, they had begun to build a love that could weather any storm. The seasons promised change again, carrying both beauty and hardship, and together they would walk into it. Two hearts healed enough to open, brave enough to remain, and tender enough to hold each other when the nights grew cold. The fire inside them had been lit, and it would not fade. Their story was only deepening, each day a quiet vow, each night a promise that neither would ever be alone again. The summer heat pressed heavy upon the land, carrying with it both promise and trial. Fields rippled with young crops, their green rows stretching toward the horizon, whispering of harvest yet to come. The chickens clucked lazily in the dust, the barn stood weathered but sturdy after their repairs, and the house itself seemed to breathe with a new rhythm. Inside those walls, laughter still had not returned, not in bursts, not yet, but there was warmth, the kind born from quiet belonging. What had begun as silence had become companionship, and what had begun as fragile trust had become a bond resilient enough to carry weight. Yet the world beyond their haven could not be silenced forever. Whispers travelled through town, growing louder with each of their visits together. Some saw her presence as defiance, others as scandal. Men with eyes too sharp lingered on her figure. Women with mouths too quick muttered behind their hands. He heard it, and though his shoulders bore the words without flinching, his heart ached at the thought of her enduring yet another gaze that sought to strip her of dignity. She heard it too, every murmur, every stare, but she walked upright beside him, her hand sometimes brushing his, as though to remind herself she did not stand alone. One afternoon, as the sun burned high, they returned from the market to find 3 riders waiting at the edge of the property. The air stilled, the horses shifting uneasily beneath their weight. The man in front carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the law bent to his favor. His words came sharp, claiming her as property, citing records, debts, and contracts forged by hands that had never known her. She stood on the porch, shoulders squared, voice steady as she said she would not go. He stepped forward, rifle at his side, his stance calm but unyielding. His voice was even when he told them to leave, but the steel in it left no room for doubt. For a moment, the tension threatened to split the air itself. Fingers twitched near holsters, eyes narrowed, the weight of violence hovered. Yet something in his stillness, something in the way she stood beside him, sent the riders away. Dust rose behind their retreating horses, leaving behind only the echo of threat. When the silence returned, she trembled, her hands clutching the shawl tighter. "They will come back," she whispered. His gaze never wavered as he answered, "Then I will be ready." She searched his face, as if looking for proof that his promise was more than words, and what she found there steadied her. That night, she left a blanket draped over the chair where he sat by the stove, a quiet gesture, simple but profound. And he, in turn, carved a mark into the porch post beneath the symbols she had made, a silent vow etched into wood that this place was theirs, not to be taken. Their love had not yet been spoken aloud, but it had been declared in every choice to stay, in every defense of one another, in every act that said, "You are not alone anymore." Days folded into weeks, and though no riders returned, the memory of them lingered. Still, their life together deepened. She took more of the house as her own, sewing torn garments, arranging herbs, even humming once as she worked in the garden. The sound startled him, not because it was loud, but because it carried lightness, the faintest melody of healing. He cherished it silently, letting it fill the corners where grief had once rooted itself. In the evenings they sat together on the porch, watching the horizon soften under the weight of dusk. She leaned her head back against the post, her hands folded in her lap, and asked questions in fragments, about his past, about his land, about the woman he had once loved and buried. He answered slowly, carefully, not out of reluctance, but out of respect for the depth of what she was offering, the willingness to know him beyond his silence. When he spoke of his late wife, she did not look away, nor did she flinch. Instead, she listened, her eyes steady, and when he finished, she whispered, "I don't want to take her place." His reply was quiet, certain. "You haven't. You never could. You are yourself, and that is enough." That night, she reached for his hand again, but this time she did not let go. They sat by the fire, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, his arm wrapping around her with a tenderness that spoke of choice, not need. The world beyond still judged, still whispered, still threatened, but within those walls they had found something stronger, the healing balm of love, born not of desperation, but of deliberate staying. As the season wore on, storms rolled over the hills. One struck sudden and fierce, lightning setting fire to the barn roof. Together they fought it, he climbing into smoke, she hauling water, both refusing to surrender. When the flames were finally smothered, when the barn still stood beneath a blackened haze, they collapsed into each other's arms, soaked, coughing, trembling. No kiss passed between them then, no words, but their embrace was fiercer than any vow, a union forged in fire and sweat and survival. He pressed his face into her hair, she gripped his shirt as though anchoring herself, and together they breathed through the smoke, alive, unbroken, whole. In the days that followed, townsfolk began to see them differently, no longer whispers of pity or scandal, but the quiet acknowledgment that neither storm nor threat had broken them. When he walked beside her in town, his hand resting lightly at her back, no one dared speak against it. And when she stood at the stall, choosing a book or a bolt of thread, she no longer lowered her gaze. She carried herself with quiet pride, a woman no longer surviving but living. One evening, as the sun slipped low and the cicadas sang their endless hymn, she asked him softly, "Do you regret it, bringing me here?" He looked at her then, steady and sure, and answered, "No, not even once." Her breath caught, her eyes glistened, and for the first time she leaned forward to kiss him, not as a test, not as a question, but as a certainty. The kiss was tender, slow, healing, filled with all the words they had never spoken. When they parted, she did not look away. Instead, she whispered, "Then I will stay." The night wrapped around them, warm and quiet, the air thick with the scent of earth and wood smoke. Inside, the cradle he had begun to build stood unfinished near the fire, its wood smooth beneath his hands. She traced its edges later, her palm lingering, her eyes soft, her silence saying more than words ever could. And he, watching her, knew without doubt that the life they had sown together was no longer fragile. It was rooted, resilient, and ready to grow. And the world beyond would still test them. Shadows would still return. Yet in that moment, on that porch beneath the endless sky, two souls who had once known only loss and silence chose each other fully. Their love was not loud, not adorned, not performed for others. It was steady, healing, eternal. And as the stars spread across the heavens, they sat side by side, knowing that whatever storms might come, they would face them together, and in that choice lay a peace stronger than fear. The next season would bring new trials, new reckonings, new moments of tenderness. But this was the foundation. Two hands clasped, two hearts healed enough to trust, two lives no longer broken, but becoming whole. The land breathed with them, the house glowed with them, and the night itself seemed to whisper a promise. You are no longer alone. The early autumn light stretched golden over the fields, softening every edge and painting the world in a warmth that seemed to mirror the quiet transformation within their hearts. By then, the land carried the marks of their shared labor, rows of crops standing tall, fences held firm by steady hands, a barn that bore the blackened scars of fire yet still stood strong. It was more than survival now. It was life, shaped and sustained together. Inside the house, the air no longer felt hollow. It carried the sense of bread baking, herbs drying, wood smoke rising, and laughter that had not yet become sound but shimmered just beneath the silence, waiting to be born. Each day wove them tighter into a fabric neither had imagined possible. She moved with a confidence that grew from trust, no longer glancing at the doors as though measuring escape. Her presence had become part of the house itself, part of him. He rose in the mornings not to emptiness, but to the faint rustle of her steps, to the soft glow of her shawl hung neatly over a chair, to the sound of water pouring into a basin where she washed her hands with quiet care. She, in turn, found his steadiness like a root beneath her feet, a grounding presence that made each breath feel less like survival and more like healing. They spoke little still, but words were no longer their only language. The brush of her hand against his when she passed him a tool, the glance she gave when she noticed his limp on colder mornings, the way he left her shawl by the fire before she reached for it. These became their dialogue. Silence had once been a prison for them both, heavy with loss, but now it was a sanctuary, a place where they were understood without needing to explain. Yet the past did not release its hold easily. One evening, as the sun bled crimson over the horizon, she confessed in halting words that she had dreamed of her brothers again, voices shouting, then falling silent. She sat on the porch, her hands gripping the edge of her skirt, eyes fixed on the darkening fields. He did not interrupt. He only sat beside her, his presence steady as stone. When she trembled, he let his hand rest over hers, not to stop the shaking, but to remind her that she did not shake alone. Her breath steadied, her eyes closed, and after a long silence she whispered, "I don't want to forget them, but I don't want to live there any more." His reply was simple, but it carried the weight of a vow. "You don't have to forget to move forward." She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder then, and for the first time the grief did not consume her. It softened, became part of the night air, no longer hers to carry alone. With each day, her healing deepened, and so did his. He who had once lived bound to memory of loss began to notice joy in small things again, the curve of her lips when she bent over the garden, the hum she sometimes released without thinking as she hung laundry, the light in her eyes when she read aloud from the battered book he had bought her in town. His grief for the wife he had buried had not vanished, but it no longer felt like a wall. It had become an echo, quieter now, allowing space for something new. He understood that love did not erase what came before. It transformed it, made room beside it, softened its edges until it no longer cut so deep. The first true laughter came on a windy afternoon. They were stacking firewood, the pile leaning precariously, when a gust knocked it loose and it tumbled around them. She startled, then looked at him with eyes wide in mock reproach. His face, usually so calm, broke into the faintest smile. She let out a short, breathless laugh, quick and unexpected, and then covered her mouth as though embarrassed. But he met her eyes, and with a rare spark said, "It's good to hear that." She froze for a moment, then lowered her hand, letting the sound spill out again, soft, hesitant, but real. The sound carried through the yard like a promise that the world could still give them light. That night, something shifted. She no longer slept with her back turned. Instead, she lay on her side, facing him across the room, her breathing steady, her eyes lingering on him until they closed. He sat in the chair as always, but his heart no longer felt the same distance. When the fire dimmed, when the night folded around them, it felt less like two survivors keeping watch, and more like two souls resting in the same rhythm. By late autumn, the house had become theirs in ways unspoken. Her symbols carved into the porch stood beside his mark. Her herbs hung beside his tools. Her shawl folded beside his coat. Two lives that had once been torn open were stitching themselves back together, the seams uneven but strong. They were no longer just surviving side by side. They were beginning to belong to each other. The first kiss had been a beginning. What followed was the slow flowering of intimacy that needed no urgency. Sometimes, as they worked in the field, her hand brushed his and lingered just a moment too long. Sometimes, as he stoked the fire, she stood close enough that her warmth touched his arm. And sometimes, when the weight of the day fell heavy, she leaned into him fully, her body fitting against his as though it had always been meant to rest there. Each touch was healing, each gesture a declaration that trust had become something deeper, something sacred. The townsfolk still whispered, but their voices no longer carried the same sting. He held her hand openly now when they walked through the market, his shoulders straight, his gaze unflinching. When eyes lingered too long, he did not falter. And when words threatened, she answered them not with anger, but with silence that carried more strength than argument. Together, they were not invincible, but they were unyielding, and in that strength lay their peace. One evening, as the first frost settled silver across the fields, she stood by the porch post where his name was carved. Her fingers traced the letters slowly, then pressed against the space just below. Without looking at him, she whispered, "You are my home." He came to stand beside her, silent, his heart too full for words. He placed his hand over hers on the wood, and together they left their touch there, as if sealing a vow into the grain of the house itself. That night she lay not in her separate bed, but beside him. No hesitation, no fear, only choice. Her hand rested on his chest, his arm wrapped around her, and their breathing became one rhythm beneath the quilt. Sleep came easier, deeper, warmer, and in the morning the world felt changed, as though the sun itself rose with gentler light. The seasons would turn again, bringing challenges neither could foresee, but in that moment they had already won something greater than any storm could take, the healing of two souls who had chosen to stay, to trust, to love. Their silence had become their song, and their togetherness had become their sanctuary. And as winter whispered at the edges of the land once more, they stepped into it side by side, no longer broken, no longer alone, but whole in the quiet power of a love they had both once thought impossible. The winter settled in with a stillness that wrapped itself around the land like a heavy quilt. Snow drifted across the fields, softening every scar of soil and fence, erasing sharp edges and leaving behind a world of muted light. Inside the house, the fire glowed warm, its crackle steady, a heartbeat within the walls. It was the first winter they faced not as two solitary survivors, but as a pair bound by something deeper than survival. Their silence was no longer lonely. It was filled with presence, the steady rhythm of two lives beating in harmony. He woke each morning to the gentle rise of her breathing beside him, the quilt pulled up around her shoulders, her hair loose across the pillow. There had been a time when waking meant facing another day of emptiness, when the ache of absence greeted him like a shadow at dawn. Now, when he turned his head and saw her there, he felt instead a quiet gratitude, a healing weight that steadied him before he even set his feet on the floor. She moved through the house with an ease that spoke of belonging. Her hands no longer trembled when she reached for the bread knife. Her eyes no longer darted to the door when a branch cracked outside. She sang softly sometimes, not a full melody, just fragments of sound, half-remembered songs of her people, humming that wove into the crackle of the fire. He never interrupted. He let the notes wrap around him, a gift she gave without realizing. The sound was healing, like the softest balm laid over old wounds. When storms came howling across the hills, shaking the shutters and rattling the roof, they faced them together. He moved to secure the barn while she tied down the chickens, both bodies moving with practiced urgency, yet never alone. And when the storm passed, leaving the world silent and white, they returned to the fire side by side, shoulders brushing, their breaths steaming into the night. Sometimes she reached for his hand without looking, fingers slipping between his, and he held on as though that simple act was the truest anchor he had ever known. There were still moments when shadows of the past rose up, when she stirred in her sleep and whispered names of those she had lost. On those nights he woke and sat quietly beside her, not to banish the memories, but to remind her that she was not alone in them. She would wake slowly, her breath uneven, and see him there, his eyes steady in the firelight. Without words, she would rest her forehead against his chest, and he would hold her until the trembling eased. Those nights were not dark. They were healing, for even grief, when shared, could soften into something bearable. As the weeks turned, they began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in fragments that mattered. She asked about his childhood, the hills he used to ride across, the river where he had once fished as a boy. He asked about her brothers, the songs they used to sing, the ridges they used to climb. Their voices were soft, hesitant at times, but each word was a step deeper into trust, a weaving of histories that no longer stood apart. He told her once that he had never imagined a future beyond surviving the day. She touched his face then, her fingers tracing the lines time had etched, and whispered, "Now you have one." In town, the whispers had not vanished, but they had changed. Some still turned their eyes, but others nodded in acknowledgement, no longer daring to dismiss what they saw. Two people who stood together, unshaken. He walked with her openly, no longer hiding his affection. His hand rested lightly at her back, guiding her through the crowded stalls, and when stares lingered, she met them with steady eyes. No shame, no fear, only presence. One evening, when they returned from market, she stopped at the porch, her gaze fixed on the post where his name was carved. Beneath it, her symbols still rested, mountain and flame, marks of her beginning. Slowly she lifted the knife he had given her, pressed its edge into the wood, and carved her name beside his. She did not speak while she worked, but when she stepped back, her breath trembled. His chest tightened as he watched, not with surprise, but with a sense of inevitability, as though the land itself had known this moment was coming. She turned to him, her eyes shimmering, and for the first time she said aloud, "This is my home." That night, their love became more than gestures, more than touches or stolen glances. It deepened into the kind of closeness that words could not fully capture, the kind that spoke in breaths shared beneath the quilt, in the warmth of skin against skin, in the steady assurance that they had both found where they were meant to be. It was tender, not rushed, filled with pauses that held reverence for what had been broken before and what was being healed now. When she laid her head against his chest afterward, her hand resting lightly over his heart, she whispered, "I am not afraid any more." He kissed the top of her hair and answered, "Neither am I." The days that followed carried a different weight, not heavier, but fuller. They worked as always, splitting wood, tending the animals, preparing for the long months ahead, but everything was touched by the quiet certainty of their bond. She smiled more, not often, but enough to light entire rooms. He laughed once, startled by her teasing when he dropped a bucket, and the sound was so rare that she froze, then laughed too, until both were breathless. The house echoed with a warmth that had been absent for years, and each echo became another stone in the foundation of the life they were building. When the first wildflowers pushed through the melting snow near the fence line, she knelt to touch them, her fingers brushing their petals with reverence. He stood behind her, watching the way her face softened, the way her lips curved faintly as if marveling at the simple stubbornness of life. She looked back at him, eyes brighter than the flowers themselves, and said softly, "We survived the winter." He stepped closer, his hand finding hers. "We did more than survive," he said. And she knew he was right. Their story was no longer just about survival or healing or silence. It had become about choosing again and again to stay, to love, to grow. Each sunrise carried them forward. Each night drew them closer, and in the steady rhythm of their days, they discovered that love did not need grand declarations to be eternal. It only needed presence, and they had given that to each other fully. The seasons promised new trials, yet as the earth softened beneath their feet and the sky stretched wide above them, they knew that whatever came next, they would not face it alone. They had been broken once, but together they had been mended. And in that mending, they had found something stronger than fear, deeper than grief, something that would carry them through every storm to come. The spring came with a tenderness neither of them had expected. Soft rains washing away the scars of winter, leaving the land glistening with promise. The house smelled of fresh earth and wood smoke, of bread rising on the hearth, and herbs drying by the window. The quiet routine of their lives had ripened into something steady, something whole, as if the land itself had been waiting for them to claim it with love. Each morning he rose to the sight of her moving gracefully through the house, her hands folding shawls or kneading dough, her hair braided neatly with a strip of cloth she had sewn herself. She, in turn, found comfort in his presence, in the way his boots thudded against the porch as he carried tools, in the way his voice, low and steady, softened when he spoke her name. Their days were no longer only about labor and survival. They were about weaving themselves into the very fabric of a shared life. He taught her the patience of planting, how to press seeds into the soil as though whispering hope into the earth. She showed him the strength of resilience, how wounds could be turned into wisdom and silence into peace. Together they moved across the land, their shadows falling side by side across rows of green, their breaths sinking with the rhythm of wind through the trees. Each moment was healing, each glance a thread binding them tighter. The neighbors, once suspicious and cruel with their words, began to change too. They saw the way she walked now, her chin raised, her eyes bright, no longer a figure of pity or judgment, but a woman who belonged where she stood. They saw the way he carried himself, no longer a man bent by grief, but someone anchored, strong, alive. In town, when whispers rose, they met them with silence that carried more weight than argument. And when the curious stared too long, he rested his hand in hers openly, steady, without shame. That quiet defiance, that healing pride, became its own kind of declaration. This is our life, and no one can unmake it. As the months unfolded, the love between them deepened beyond touch, beyond words. It became the very air they breathed. At night, she lay beside him, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart as if it were the truest lullaby. He would press a kiss to her hair, breathing in the warmth of her presence, marveling at how the silence that once suffocated him now felt like the sweetest song. Their love was not loud, not rushed, but deliberate, built in layers of trust, in the healing rhythm of ordinary days that became extraordinary because they were shared. One evening, beneath a sky awash with stars, she placed his hand gently over her belly. At first he did not understand, his calloused fingers resting uncertainly against her warmth. Then her eyes met his, soft and unwavering, and the truth blossomed between them like a dawn breaking. He froze, breath caught, heart thundering with both wonder and fear. She nodded slowly, her lips trembling with a smile that was fragile and fierce at once. "You're sure?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She nodded again, pressing his palm more firmly to her body. "I am." The weight of it settled into him, not as a burden, but as a miracle. He had thought his future ended years ago, thought life had given him only silence and grief. Now here she stood, carrying not only herself, but the seed of tomorrow, proof that love could mend what loss had once destroyed. Tears blurred his vision, though he did not let them fall. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as though anchoring himself to the reality of her, of them, of the life they had created. She pressed her face into his chest, and for the first time in years they both wept, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming healing power of hope. From that night forward, every day carried new meaning. He built a cradle from cedar, smoothing the wood with his own hands until it gleamed, carving symbols into its edges, mountains for strength, water for life, fire for resilience, and two crossing lines for the union they had forged. She ran her fingers over the carvings, eyes glistening, her hand lingering on his as if to say, "We made this together." She began to hum as she worked, her voice steady now, no longer trembling, her songs weaving light through the house. They faced challenges still, fields that faltered under drought, neighbors whose words still cut, nights when old memories returned to haunt her dreams. But never again did they face them alone. When she woke from shadows, he was there. When his leg ached from old wounds, she laid her hand over it, her touch healing in its quiet strength. Together they carried every burden, together they bore every joy. And when the child's first stirrings became undeniable, when her body began to round with the shape of new life, he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time all over again. Not just as the woman he had brought into his home, not just as the partner who had healed his heart, but as the mother of the life they had chosen to create. His voice shook when he whispered, "I didn't think I'd get to have this again." She smiled softly, pressing her lips to his. "And neither did I, but here we are." The seasons turned once more, carrying them into a summer rich with promise. Their porch, once marked only by his name and her symbols, now carried both carved letters side by side, a testament to the life they had built. The house, once hollow, now echoed with warmth, with belonging, with the anticipation of laughter yet to come. And the fields, once barren with silence, now bloomed under their care, each row a reminder that healing was not only possible, but alive. On quiet evenings, they sat together with her hand resting over her belly, his arm wrapped firmly around her. They spoke of the future in fragments, what they would teach, how they would protect, what kind of world they wanted their child to inherit. Each word was a prayer, each glance a promise. The stars above seemed to listen, their light steady, eternal, carrying those prayers into the night. Their story was not about rescue or possession, not about tragedy or loss. It was about two souls who had chosen, again and again, to stay, to trust, to love. It was about healing not only wounds of the past, but planting roots for a future strong enough to weather storms. And as they held each other, their love alive in every breath, they knew that whatever came, they had already found everything they had once thought lost. And if you, reading these words, feel even a spark of warmth, a flicker of healing in your own heart, let it remind you that love, real love, does not rush, does not demand, does not destroy. It builds, it heals, it stays. If this story has touched you, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share your voice with ours. Press, like if the warmth of their journey brought comfort to you, and subscribe so we can continue weaving stories of hope and love together. Every gesture, no matter how small, is part of the circle of healing, a way for us all to remind each other. No one has to walk alone.